It is the 22nd of February 1945, and you are lying flat against the frozen slope of an old Prussian gun ditch on the northern edge of Poznan. Above you rises a rampart of packed earth and brick, the wall of the Fort Winiary citadel, the last German strongpoint in a city that Berlin declared a fortress a month ago. Behind you, an engine builds to a roar. A T-34 climbs onto the improvised bridge your sappers spent 3 days building across the ditch. And where the bow machine gun should be, there is instead a squat steel nozzle. When it clears the lip of the wall, it does not fire its main gun. A long rod of fire reaches out across the yard and washes over the mouth of a casemate, and the position that held your rifle companies at bay for a week goes silent. That tank was the OT-34, the flame-throwing version of the most famous tank of the Second World War. And this is the story of how a handful of them helped reduce a fortress city that Adolf Hitler had ordered held to the last. To understand the weapon, you first have to understand the tank it was built from. The T-34 was already the backbone of the Red Army by 1945, a medium tank prized for sloped armour, a wide track that carried it across mud and snow, and the 76mm gun that could fight almost anything the Germans fielded when it first appeared. The Soviet Union built it in enormous numbers, and that scale is exactly why a flame variant made sense. When you already have thousands of a reliable chassis rolling off the lines, you can afford to divert some of them to a specialised job. And one job the Red Army needed done again and again was clearing fortified positions that a normal tank gun could not crack. A high explosive shell is a blunt tool against a bunker. It can collapse a weak wall, but a well-built concrete emplacement with a narrow firing slit will shrug off round after round while the machine gun inside keeps a rifle company pinned in the open. What the attackers needed was a weapon that did not have to breach the wall at all, a weapon that could reach through the firing slit itself and make the inside of the position untenable. That is what a flame projector does, and mounting one on a tank meant the crew could bring it right up to the wall under armour thick enough to survive the defenders' return fire. The Soviets had experimented with flame tanks before the war, but the design that mattered here came out of trials in the spring of 1941. A team at Factory No. 174 produced an automatic flame projector, the AT-041, and it won its trials in May of that year. It was a genuinely clever device. Instead of the whole machine gun that a standard T-34 carried beside the driver, the flame tank mounted this projector, fed from a fuel tank of about 28 gallons carried inside the hull. Compressed air pushed the thickened fuel out through the nozzle, and an ignition system lit it as it left the tube. It could throw its fire out to a required range of close to 100 yards, and it carried enough fuel for around 10 separate bursts before it needed refilling. The most important design decision, and the one that set the OT-34 apart from other flame tanks, was what the engineers chose not to give up. The projector went where the bow machine gun had been, tucked into the front of the hull. That meant the turret was left completely alone. The tank kept its full 76mm main gun. From the outside, at any distance, an OT-34 looked exactly like an ordinary T-34, and it fought like one too. It could shell a building, engage another tank, and support infantry with its cannon, and only when it closed to short range did the defenders discover that this particular tank also carried fire. That distinction matters because the Soviets built another flame tank that made the opposite choice. The heavy KV-8 mounted its flame projector inside the turret, and to fit it the designers had to remove the heavy tank's main gun and replace it with a much smaller 45mm weapon, which they then disguised inside a wider barrel jacket so it would look like a full-caliber gun from outside. The KV-8 traded away its firepower to carry flame. The OT-34 gave up almost nothing. It kept the gun, kept the profile, and added a second weapon that no enemy could see coming. For the close, ugly work of clearing a fortified city, that combination was close to ideal. The projector was improved as the war went on. By 1942 and into 1943, the design was upgraded to a new model that pushed the maximum range out to about 140 yards under the best conditions, carried more fuel, and held more compressed air so it could fire more bursts before running dry. In practice, the effective range depended heavily on the fuel mixture and the wind, and gunners could expect to reach anywhere from 65 to well over 100 yards depending on the day. A later revision drew on the tank's own engine exhaust to help propel the flame, which reduced the number of bulky compressed air cylinders the crew had to carry. Production of the flame tank began in the summer of 1942, after the first prototype had been built the previous year. It was assembled at the Krasnoye Sormovo works and at other tank plants, always on whatever version of the T-34 happened to be in production at the time. So, late war examples carried the same improvements as their gun-armed brothers. By the end of the war, the factories had turned out something on the order of 1,170 of the 76mm flame tanks, with a further 210 built on the later 85mm chassis, and roughly 190 more produced in the second half of 1945. Against a total T-34 run that reached into the tens of thousands, the flame tanks were a small specialist fraction, and that is how they were used, held back and committed where a wall of fire was the tool the situation demanded. The situation at Poznań demanded exactly that. In the middle of January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, a massive drive that opened on the 12th of January and carried Soviet forces westward out of Poland toward the German border and the Oder River. Leading one of the main thrusts was the 8th Guards Army under General Vasily Chuikov, an army of roughly 100,000 men, and these were not ordinary troops. They were the veterans of Stalingrad, soldiers who had learned street fighting in the rubble of that city and who understood better than almost anyone alive how to take a defended urban position apart building by building. Sitting directly across their line of advance was Poznań, known to the Germans as Poznan. It was an old fortress city, and that description was literal rather than figurative. During the 19th century, when the region was under Prussian rule, engineers had ringed the city with a belt of 18 massive forts, built of brick and earth, and spaced about 1.25 miles apart in a ring with a radius of roughly 3 miles. At the heart of the defences, on high ground north of the city centre, stood the citadel of Fort Winiary, the strongest work of them all, protected by a deep ditch and a towering rampart. These were not modern fortifications, but they had been built to absorb artillery, and against them the age of the walls counted for very little. On or about the 20th of January, with Soviet spearheads closing in, Hitler declared Poznań a Festung, a fortress that was to be held to the last man regardless of the strategic situation. The garrison assembled to hold it was a mixed force. Estimates of its size vary, and the true figure is contested, but it is generally put somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 men. They came from a great range of units: regular Wehrmacht soldiers, Waffen SS troops, Luftwaffe ground personnel with no aircraft left to service, police detachments, Volkssturm militia, and a large body of highly motivated officer candidates from the city's military schools. Young men who fought with a discipline and stubbornness that made the reduction of the city far harder than its improvised garrison might have suggested. Armour was almost non-existent. The defence could call on a single heavy tank company that amounted to 1 Tiger, 2 Panthers, 1 Panzer IV, and a handful of assault guns, against Chuikov's army that was a token force, but inside Brick Fort's armour mattered less than the walls themselves. The way Poznań came to be besieged tells you something about how the Soviets fought in 1945. The offensive that opened on the 12th of January was built for speed, and its armoured spearheads were not meant to stop for fortified cities. When they reached Poznań, the fast-moving tank formations swung around it and drove on westward toward the Oder and the approaches to Berlin, leaving the fortress encircled in their wake. The city was not in the path of the advance, so much as an obstacle to be sealed off and dealt with separately, and the job of dealing with it fell to Chuikov's 8th Guards Army. That is why the fighting at Poznań took the shape it did. It was not a battle of manoeuvre, but a deliberate, grinding reduction, an army settling in to take a fortress apart while the war rushed past it toward the German capital. A siege of that kind rewards patience and specialised tools over speed, and it was exactly the kind of fight in which a flame tank came into its own. The 8th Guards Army arrived before the city around the 25th of January and began the methodical business of taking it apart. The very next day, the 26th, Two of the forts on the southern side fell to a hasty assault delivered by the 27th and 74th Guards Rifle Divisions, an opening success that showed the outer ring could be broken. But the Soviets quickly learned that speed alone would be costly. The forts had to be reduced one at a time, and Chuikov reached for the method he had perfected in the ruins of Stalingrad. That method was the Storm Group. Beginning around the 27th of January, the assault on Poznan was carried by specialized detachments. The Soviets called Sturmovые группы, storm groups, each a small combined arms team built for exactly this kind of close fighting. A storm group mixed riflemen, submachine gunners, combat engineers with demolition charges, heavy weapons brought forward to fire over open sights, and, crucially, tanks and flame units. The idea was that no single arm could crack a fortified position on its own, but a tight team that carried all of them together could isolate a strong point, suppress it, breach it, and clear it before the defenders in the next position could react. Flexibility was the whole point, because once the group pushed inside a fort or a heavy building, it would meet situations no plan could predict, and it had to be able to solve them on the spot with the weapons in hand. This was not improvised. Chuikov had built the doctrine 2 years earlier in the ruins of Stalingrad, where his 62nd Army had held the west bank of the Volga against a far larger German force by refusing to fight the battle the enemy wanted. Instead of massing in the open where German artillery and aircraft could reach them, his men had broken down into small groups that fought at arm's length inside the rubble, close enough that the Germans could not call in their heavy weapons without hitting their own troops. The Storm Group was the formal expression of that lesson, a permanent small team trained to fight in exactly the confined, close, unpredictable conditions that fortifications and city blocks imposed. When the same army arrived at Poznan, it brought that hard-won method with it, and the ring of Prussian forts was, from a tactical point of view, simply another set of strong points to be isolated and cleared by the same means that had worked on the Volga. Into that framework, the flame tank fit perfectly. A surviving Soviet account of the fighting describes the composition of one assault group tasked on the 10th of February with blocking one of the numbered forts. It was built around 3 high-powered guns firing directly, 2 T-34 tanks, a platoon of infantry, a platoon of sappers, and a unit of flamethrower troops working alongside them. That is the Storm Group in miniature, and it shows how the flame weapon was meant to be used, not charging alone, but woven into a team that could pin the defenders, cover the flame vehicle as it closed, and exploit the opening the moment the position was cleared. The drill by which such a tank closed on a fort is worth describing, because it explains why the crews accepted the risk. A flame projector with a reach of roughly 100 yards is a short-range weapon by the standards of an army that fought at miles, which meant the flame tank had to drive straight toward a position that was doing everything in its power to stop it. What made that survivable was the very thing the design had preserved. Because the tank kept its full 76mm gun and its armour, it could fight its way forward on its own account, shelling the strong point and forcing the defenders to keep their heads down while it covered the last 100 yards. The gun-armed tanks of the Storm Group and the guns firing over open sights added their weight, so that the flame vehicle approached inside a curtain of suppressing fire. Only when it reached the wall did it use the weapon the defenders could not answer. The thickened fuel it threw clung to whatever it struck, and could be played through a firing slit or across an embrasure. And because it did not depend on breaching the wall, the thickness of the masonry that made the fort strong against shells did nothing at all to stop it. The reason the flame tank was worth all that coordination comes down to what fire does to a fortified position, which is something no other weapon in the Storm Group could reliably achieve. A fort of this kind was a maze of casemates, galleries, and firing chambers connected by tunnels, and its strength lay in the fact that the defenders were behind thick walls and could only be reached through narrow openings. A tank shell that struck the outer wall spent its force on masonry. Rifle and machine gun fire could not turn a corner, but a jet of burning fuel aimed at a firing slit did not need to breach anything. It could be played directly across the opening, and the pressure and heat made the chamber behind it impossible to hold. Positions that had stopped repeated infantry assaults were cleared in a matter of moments, once a flame tank could bring its nozzle to bear, and the defenders in adjoining chambers, seeing what had happened, frequently abandoned their positions rather than wait for the same treatment. The weapon's effect was as much on the will to hold as on the physical strongpoint. A garrison that knew fire was coming through the walls could not stand in the way. The fortress design assumed it would. Through the first days of February, the storm groups worked inward through the ring of forts, and the flame tanks earned their keep at each one. The Soviets, in Chuikov's own summary of the fighting, hammered relentlessly with aircraft, with tanks and with flame. Fort by fort, the outer belt was reduced. By the early part of February, most of the city itself had fallen, and the fighting narrowed toward the last redoubt. By the 12th of February, the German garrison held only one position of any consequence, the citadel of Fort Winiary on its hill north of the centre. Everything else was gone or surrounded, and the survivors of the garrison had pulled back into the strongest work the 19th century engineers had built. The reduction of the fortress was not the work of the 8th Guards Army alone. Chuikov committed several of his own divisions to the task, and they were joined by formations from the 69th Army under General Vladimir Kolpatsky, with rifle and guards divisions arrayed on the northern, eastern and southern faces of the defence, so that the citadel was pressed from every side at once. This was a siege in the old sense, a ring of force tightening on a single fortified point, but the tools closing that ring were thoroughly modern, and among them the flame tanks held a place out of all proportion to their numbers. The citadel itself presented the attackers with a problem that felt almost medieval. Fort Winiary was fronted by a deep dry ditch and a high rampart, and there was no easy way across. The Soviet troops, an army that had fought across 1,000 miles of modern battlefield, found themselves reduced to carrying ladders forward and climbing them under fire, because the ditch and the wall left them no better option. As the assault parties went over the lip, the citadel's inner redoubts opened fire on them from positions that the ladders could not reach, and the tanks, still stranded on the far side of the ditch, could not yet support. The final assault on the citadel opened on the 18th of February, and for 3 days it ground forward at close quarters, the storm groups working to neutralise the redoubts one at a time while the engineers laboured to solve the real problem, which was how to get armour across the ditch. The answer was an improvised bridge. Under fire, Soviet sappers built a crossing sturdy enough to bear the weight of tanks and heavy vehicles, and early on the 22nd of February the armour finally went over. T-34s and assault guns rolled into the main grounds of the old fortress, and with them came the flame tanks that the redoubts had been designed to keep at arm's length. Once armour was inside the walls, the calculation that had held the citadel together came apart. The defenders' redoubts had been built to face an enemy on the outside of the ditch, and now the fire was coming from within their own courtyard, delivered by vehicles that could stand off the mouth of each casemate and clear it directly. The interior positions were reduced one after another, and the defence, which had held for the better part of a month, collapsed in hours. That evening, the German commander of the citadel, Generalmajor Ernst Matten, who had taken charge of the final defence, surrendered the last of his men to Chuikov. The number who laid down their arms at the end was about 12,000, the remnant of a garrison that had begun the siege at several times that strength. The citadel was formally in Soviet hands on the 23rd of February, closing a battle for the city that had run since the last week of January, roughly 4 weeks of continuous fighting rather than the lightning action that is sometimes imagined. Any account that compresses the siege of Poznan into a day or two has simply got the record wrong. This was a month-long reduction of a fortified city, fort by fort and chamber by chamber, and its length is precisely the measure of how hard the officer candidates and their mixed garrison fought. The cost on both sides was heavy. The German garrison suffered losses generally estimated at more than 5,000 over the course of the battle, on top of the 12,000 taken prisoner at the end. Soviet losses were higher still, put at more than 12,000 casualties across the siege, a sobering figure that reflects the reality of assaulting prepared fortifications, no matter how modern the assault force. The old brick forts, obsolete on paper, extracted a real price from the army that took them, and they did it against troops who had already learned every lesson urban warfare had to teach. That is worth holding on to, because it explains why the flame tank mattered so much. Anything that could reduce a strong point faster, or persuade its garrison to abandon it sooner, translated directly into Soviet soldiers who did not have to cross that ditch and climb that ladder into the guns. It is easy, looking back, to let the flame weapon overshadow everything around it, and that would be a mistake. The OT-34 did not take Poznań. Chuikov's storm groups took Poznań, 100,000 veterans applying a doctrine forged in Stalingrad, with artillery firing over open sights, with sappers building bridges under fire and blowing breaches in brick, with riflemen crossing open ground and climbing walls, and with the flame tanks providing the one capability the rest of the team could not. The weapon was decisive in the narrow tactical sense, at the mouth of a specific casemate at a specific moment, and it was one instrument in a much larger machine, but it was the instrument that made the fortress design obsolete. A fort is a way of forcing an attacker to come at you through openings you control, and a weapon that reaches through those openings with fire takes that advantage away. The 19th century engineers who built the ring around Poznań had planned against artillery and infantry, and even against tanks. They had no answer for a tank that carried its own fire and could not be told, apart from an ordinary one, until it was already at the wall. That is the quiet genius of the design, and the reason the OT-34 deserves to be remembered as more than a footnote to the famous tank it was built from. The Soviets did not invent a new machine to solve the fortress problem. They took the tank they already had by the thousand, the most produced and most reliable armoured vehicle of the war, and they made a small, disciplined change. They pulled out the bow machine gun, dropped in a flame projector and a fuel tank, and left everything else exactly as it was. The result kept the full gun, kept the armour, kept the mobility, and kept the silhouette, and it added a weapon perfectly suited to the ugliest job on the Eastern Front, the reduction of a fortified city that had been ordered to hold to the last. At Poznań, that job was done in 4 hard weeks, fort by fort, ladder by ladder, and casemate by casemate. When the armour finally crossed the improvised bridge into the courtyard of Fort Winiary on the 22nd of February, the fortress that Hitler had ordered held forever had less than a day left. The forts that had stood since the age of Prussia, and the garrison that had defended them with real courage, were undone in the end by 100,000 veterans, a doctrine written in the rubble of Stalingrad, and a handful of the most famous tanks of the war carrying a weapon that the walls were never built to stop.